And welcome back to Inside Story. I'm Adam May, filling in for Ray Suarez. 2014 represented the 6th year in a row that the birth rate in America has declined. On average, the number of babies being born per woman is 1.86. That is well below the 2.1 that is needed for a stable population. This is all according to the National Center for Health Statistics. Perhaps one way to reverse this trend is trying to make starting a family or having another child more conducive. We're joined now by Elizabeth Peters. She is the director of the Center on Labor, Human Services, and Population at the Urban Institute. And also joining us here, Horace Cooper, a legal commentator and adjunct fellow at the National Center for Public Policy Research. Both of you, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Do you think that this country has the will to move forward and try to enact some sort of mandatory paid leave, Elizabeth?
So I don't know whether the country has the will, but I know that the discussion is happening right now, and there seems to be some movement with a number of states having adopted family leave, paid family leave over the last decade, and the conversation really turning to making the business case. So it's happening.
So California right now, they've had this law in the books for a number of years. They are looking at expanding these benefits once again. They say that it's working out there. The conversation is starting. Hillary Clinton has brought it up on the campaign trail, but we're not hearing anything from any of the Republican candidates. Horace, should we be talking about this issue right now?
We should be talking about it, but we shouldn't be talking about it necessarily in the context of this is something we need to do. We should be talking about what are we doing to encourage growth and job creation. Just one quick point, in the state of Texas, we're seeing migration from companies leaving California to go to Texas. Now, people talk about the kinds of protections. There's a significant difference between the protections that employers and employees have in California versus Texas.
Well, that is always the concern that is raised whenever they start talking about issuing any sort of a mandate, and that is that the jobs are going to pick up, they're going to flee, the people are going to run out of that state. And yes, Texas definitely is picking up companies, but there are still lots of companies that are doing business in California. Isn't it good for companies to go ahead and offer this? We just heard from KPMG that in fact they are seeing higher retention rates and that the numbers play out in favor of offering this paid leave.
When you say is it good versus must you do it, whether you want to or not, those are two different conversations. If it's good, a company can look at the facts, they can have a conversation with their own employees and make that determination. I've got no problem if an employer decides that a great way to retain employees for a long term is to take this on. I have a problem with if that turns out not to be cost effective for an employer, telling them you're going to do it anyway.
So you have a problem with the mandate. Elizabeth, do we need a mandate now? It's been 20 years since FMLA was passed. When that law first went into effect, if you look back at some of the articles written back then, people thought more companies would be extending paid leave than actually have right now. We're talking, this is a benefit that's only extended to, 12 to 16% of the American workforce.
So I definitely think we should be talking about it. It's clear that many other countries have it. I think the conversation needs to talk about more than just job creation. It also needs to talk about families. And we know that dads are really important for kids. Moms are important for kids. And spending time, quality time with kids is really important for their long-term development. So I think that needs to be brought into the equation as well.
But the question remains, should there be a federal mandate? Should we be changing federal laws and saying to companies, you have to offer some sort of paid leave? Is the market way of doing things simply failing in this case?
I guess I don't want to answer the question should, because there are balances. I mean, there are costs and benefits to this. There are going to be potential costs to some businesses, but I do think we need to bring the family into the equation. And I don't think we've done enough studies to know all the potential unintended consequences, but we do have a lot of examples of cases where it has worked. So I think we need to have that kind of conversation and maybe do a little more better understanding of what might be the potential downside, because we need to think about that before mandating it.
Yeah, I concur with the idea that we want to think about it before mandating, but I also think we want to look more carefully at the data that we're using to assess. When we say that it's 12% of the population, what we are not looking at is the reality. Since the Great Recession, 70% of the new jobs have been created in small business with one particular component of interest, and that is this freelance, this independent contractor phenomenon. And the market may be letting people in those settings set their own schedules and accommodating some of the priorities that they have in a way that if we only assume we all are going to work for IBM or we're only going to work for GM with the structured schedule, the market is probably coming up with some solutions more dynamic.
Well, there is no question, though, that there's disparity right now in who is actually getting the benefit of the paid leave. It's not the part-time worker at the fast food place. You have to be a full-time employee. In many cases, you have to be working at some nice big company like you're mentioning. It raises the question, should we consider a tax increase? Would you look at what they're doing over in Europe? A lot of times these family medical leave plans are funded through their Social Security systems. It's paid for with tax dollars. The burden is not always on the company. Sometimes it's a combination thereof. Should we talk about some sort of a tax so people can get this benefit?
Again, I think the conversation needs to
And we're having that
happen.
conversation right now.
But-
So should
but
we
I
be
think-
doing that? Is anybody looking at that?
I don't know that we know the exact solution to make this happen. I think we know that it's really important for workers to have the flexibility to take time off, to care for sick children, for other dependents. That's actually really critical for the functioning of the family. How we make that happen, I think, is likely to be a combination of some private market and maybe some maybe some mandated law, but we haven't actually had the conversation enough to really figure out what are the components of that kind of law. So
Where does this conversation begin? Where do we start this conversation? Does it need to come from the campaign trail? Should it come up during the upcoming presidential debates? Do we need to raise it to that level so we actually have a serious conversation about this again in this country? Or are we just settling right now for the fact that there are many American women out there that give birth and then they simply have to go back to work weeks later because they can't afford to take the FMLA?
Well, first of all, the American people can't afford new taxes. They are overtaxed, and in this significant downturn that many Americans increasingly say that they haven't experienced any recovery from, I think you'll find a significant lack of interest in that. But I want to address the issue about the part-time workers. I'm talking about people who are doing interior decorating and they do it as a freelancer. I'm talking about the people that actually work at large corporations, but they are not employees of those corporations, and they come in and they offer consulting services and the like. A significant number of the small businesses in America over just the last 10 years look like those kinds of organizations and individuals, and they have a lot more control over their schedule.
Last thoughts from each of you guys. What would you ask people to consider right now as we talk about this? Elizabeth.
I would ask that people think about the family and its role in raising children and the difficulties that families have.
It's a family issue. And Horace, real quick.
Same thing. I think we need to have the conversation, but we need to have the conversation in the idea mom and dad both have a responsibility to provide for those kids. What are we doing to create an environment where they can do that well, responsibly, and financially?
All right, both of you guys, Elizabeth Peters of the Urban Institute and Horace Cooper of the National Center for Public Policy Research, thank you so much for joining us and at least starting the conversation right now.